This is a review of the lab on respiratory and urinary systems. We'll start with the respiratory system. The organs of the respiratory system you were assigned in lab include the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. In this diagram out of your textbook, you can see that the nose is the only externally appearing part of the respiratory system. The oral cavity is pointed out for reference. The pharynx runs behind the nose and the mouth. It empties into the larynx. The larynx is connected to the trachea. The trachea ends by branching into the right and left primary or main bronchi, which connect to each lung. The diaphragm forms the floor of the thoracic cavity. Functions of the respiratory system include gas exchanges between the blood and the external environment, which occurs in the alveoli of the lungs, and passageways to the lungs purify, humidify, and warm the incoming air. The nose is the only externally visible part of the respiratory system. Air enters the nose through the external nares, or nostrils. The interior of the nose consists of a nasal cavity divided by a nasal septum. The nasal septum is a midline structure which can only be seen clearly in a cross-sectional view. Lateral walls of the nasal cavity are folded into the nasal conchae. The floor of the nasal cavity is made up of the hard and soft palate. Connecting to the nasal cavity are the paranasal sinuses. In this diagram, you can see two of the paranasal sinuses. You can see the nasal cavity is the interior of the nose. The nasal septum cannot be seen in this view because it shows up only in the midline. The nasal conchae, there are three, a superior, a middle, and an inferior. The external nares just on one side. The nasal cavity ends by emptying into the nasopharynx, which is the upper part of the pharynx. The nasopharynx continues as the oropharynx behind the oral cavity and the laryngopharynx behind the larynx. The palate, hard palate, is the bony palate. The soft palate is a muscular partition, which ends in an extension called the uvula. That forms the dividing line between the nasal cavity above and the oral cavity below. The tongue is shown here for reference. At the base of the tongue sits the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone not only anchors the tongue, it also anchors the larynx. The larynx includes several structures, including the epiglottis, which is a flap of cartilage which closes over the opening into the airways, and the vocal cords. The esophagus, which is part of the digestive system, sits behind the trachea. The laryngopharynx empties into either the air passageways of the larynx, or if it's food and liquid, gets swallowed down the esophagus. There are four bones that contain paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses are cavities within the bones that surround the nasal cavities. The functions of the paranasal sinuses, in addition to lightening the skull by having air-filled chambers instead of solid bone, sinuses act as resonance chambers for speech, which you're aware of anytime your sinuses are stopped up. It affects the quality of your speech. The mucus that is produced will drain into the nasal cavity. The pharynx, which is the technical term for the throat, is a muscular passage. It has three regions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The oropharynx and laryngopharynx both are common passageways for air and food. Here you see clearly marked the three regions of the pharynx. The larynx, or voice box, routes air and food into the proper channels. The way it does that is that the spoon-shaped flap of elastic cartilage, the epiglottis, folds over the air passageway every time you swallow. The larynx also includes the vocal cords, which are important for speech. The thyroid cartilage is the largest of the cartilages of the larynx. In males, this is often referred to as a prominent Adam's apple. The epiglottis is the flap of cartilage that closes off the air passageway when you swallow. The vocal folds, also known as the true vocal cords, vibrate when you talk. The glottis is the opening between the vocal cords. The trachea is only about 4 inches long. It connects the larynx with the primary bronchi. Its walls are reinforced with cartilage, hyaline cartilage, which is C-shaped, open in the back. The cartilage prevents the trachea from collapsing shut. The lining of the trachea is a ciliated epithelium, which beats to remove mucus up and out of the respiratory tract. The main or primary bronchi are formed by the division of the trachea at its inferior end. They enter each lung at the hilum. The right bronchus is wider, shorter, and straighter than the left, so generally if you have inhaled a solid object, it's more likely to get stuck on the right side than the left side. The primary bronchi branch into subdivisions, which also branch, so that the bronchial tree gets subdivided into smaller and smaller branches. All but the smallest of these branches have reinforcing cartilage in their wall. So we start with a primary bronchi, and then within each lung, the primary bronchus enters each lung. The rest of the bronchial tree is contained within the lung. Here you can see the smallest branches of the bronchial tree. Notice that there's no cartilage in these tiny branches. The dark red tissue in this image is smooth muscle. Each of the smallest branches will end by dividing into an alveolar sac. Each alveolar sac is composed of individual alveoli. Each alveolus, also called an air sac, is where gas exchange will occur. When gas exchange occurs, blood becomes either oxygenated or deoxygenated. As air passes into the lungs and raises the oxygen level, oxygen is able to move into the blood passing through the alveolar capillaries. At the same time, carbon dioxide is removed in the alveolar capillaries. So oxygenated blood drains through pulmonary veins to the left side of the heart, out to the systemic arteries. Tissue capillaries then are the site of oxygen being delivered and CO2 being picked up. So systemic veins carry high CO2 levels and low oxygen levels. We call this deoxygenated blood. Systemic veins drain the blood back to the right side of the heart, which pumps the blood through the pulmonary arteries, which delivers the blood back to the alveoli to drop off the CO2 and pick up the oxygen. Let's move on to a review of the urinary system. The organs of the urinary system include the right and left kidneys, the right and left ureters, a single urinary bladder, and a single urethra. In this diagram, you can see the right kidney and right ureter, the left kidney and left ureter, the ureters emptying into the urinary bladder, which is drained by the urethra. Each kidney has 3 regions. The renal cortex is the outer region, the renal medulla is inside of the cortex, and the renal pelvis is a hollow area where urine collects. In this diagram, you can see the renal cortex, the renal medulla, which consists of structures called renal pyramids, and the interior part here, which is all going to empty into the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis ends by forming the upper part of the ureter. At the renal hilus, the knot-shaped area on the medial side of each kidney, is where the ureter, the renal artery, and the renal vein connect to the kidney. The outer layer of each kidney is called the renal capsule. The renal sinus is the space inside of the hilus. The nephron is the structural and functional unit of the kidney. It's responsible for formation of urine. There are two main structures in each nephron, the glomerulus and the renal tubule. This diagram is showing a close-up of one renal pyramid and the cortex associated with it. The cortex is where the nephrons are, for the most part, located. There is one part of the nephron that drops down into the pyramid. The collecting duct will start up in the cortex and drain all the way through the pyramid. A nephron starts out as a glomerulus, which is a little knot of capillaries, surrounded by a layer of tissue called the Bowman's capsule. The Bowman's capsule is the first part of the renal tubule. It will collect the fluid out of the blood that has filtered out of the glomeruli. Here you can see the blood supply to the glomerular capillaries. Blood enters the glomerulus from an afferent arteriole, and blood drains from the glomerular capillaries through an efferent arteriole. The glomerular capsule actually has two layers. The inner layer of the glomerular capsule covers the capillaries. Between those two layers is the space of the glomerular capsule, and this is where the fluid will collect as it drains into the rest of the renal tubule. The renal tubule extends from the glomerular capsule to the collecting duct. The four parts of the renal tubule include the glomerular capsule, also known as Bowman's capsule, the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule. In this diagram, we can find all the parts of the nephron, starting at the glomerular capillaries, surrounded by the glomerular capsule. From there, we're going to move into the proximal convoluted tubule. From the convoluted tubule to the loop of Henle. From the loop of Henle to the distal convoluted tubule, which will empty into the collecting duct. The collecting duct is not considered part of the nephron. We also in this image see the blood vessels associated with the urinary system. Here's the afferent arteriole. It brings blood into the glomerular capillaries. The efferent arteriole, which is drained into a series of capillaries called the peritubular capillaries. The peritubular capillaries work with the renal tubule to finalize urine formation, and they will finally drain into the venous drainage of the kidney. The collecting duct receives urine from many nephrons. As it continues, it will run through the renal pyramids and deliver urine into the renal pelvis. Each ureter will drain urine into the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder will hold urine, storing it until it's convenient to empty the bladder. The muscle in the bladder wall will contract, the sphincters will relax, and that will allow urine to leave the bladder through the urethra. The urinary bladder is a smooth, collapsible, muscular sac that can store urine and then contract to expel the urine. The trigone is the triangular region at the base of the bladder with the openings forming its three corners, two openings from the ureters and one from the urethra. In males, the prostate gland surrounds the neck of the bladder. Finally, we'll have a short review of pH balance and the filtering properties of the urine. Functions of the urinary system include regulating certain aspects of homeostasis. These include making sure there's a sufficient amount of water, not too much, not too little, the right concentration of electrolytes such as sodium and chloride, proper pH or acid-base balance in the blood, regulation of blood pressure and red blood cell production, and activation of vitamin D. Blood composition depends on what you eat, what your cells produce, and what you excrete. Kidneys have 4 roles in maintaining blood composition. They excrete the nitrogen-containing wastes, which are produced either from what you eat or from what your cells produce. They maintain the water balance by excreting excess or conserving when necessary. They maintain electrolyte balance, likewise, by excreting excess or conserving when necessary, and ensuring proper blood pH by excreting either acid or base, depending on the pH balance. Here you can see the main systems of the body that impact the composition of the blood. The lungs provide oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. Your digestive system provides nutrients, water, and ions. And the kidneys balance the removal of water and ions and nitrogenous wastes. Blood pH must remain between 7.35 and 7.45 to maintain homeostasis. Any pH above 7.45 is considered alkalosis. Acidosis occurs when the pH drops below 7.35. Physiological acidosis is a pH between 7.35 and 7.0 because officially anything above 7.0 is in fact alkalosis. Most ions in the blood originate as byproducts of cellular metabolism. Please don't forget that also you ingest ions as well. Acids produced by the body include lactic acid and fatty acids. Carbon dioxide forms carbonic acid. Most acid-base balance is maintained by the kidneys, but you have buffers in the blood who can chemically neutralize acids and bases, and the respiratory system can also help balance pH. Respiratory control of pH is by controlling carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide produces an increase in hydrogen ion concentration through the production of carbonic acid. If you have excess hydrogen ions in the blood, you can hyperventilate to get rid of excess carbon dioxide, and this will reduce the pH of the blood. Kidneys can excrete bicarbonate ions if needed, or conserve, that is, reabsorb bicarbonate ions as needed. In this way, the renal mechanisms, by controlling bicarbonate ions, control pH. When blood pH rises, bicarbonate can be excreted, and hydrogen ions can be retained by the kidneys. When blood pH falls, bicarbonate ions can be reabsorbed and hydrogen ions secreted. Urine pH can vary from 4.5, which is very acidic, up to 8.0, which is quite alkaline. So whether you have too much acid in the body or not enough acid in the body, your kidneys can regulate pH balance.